Let's talk about the authorship of the book of Mark. As I mentioned last week, all of our Gospels, all our canonical Gospels are anonymous. There are no allusions or clues in the text as to who this might be that put this together. There are some who make some suggestions for later in the book that for years I thought might make a compelling argument, but I have since changed my mind on that, so we'll talk about that when we get to the end. We also mentioned last week that one of the suggestions for why no author takes credit for the Gospels is because no author wants to take credit for the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And that maybe that's why we don't have authorship claims in these texts. Church tradition, attributes the Gospel to John Mark. It is a fairly early tradition, may very well be a first century tradition. John Mark, you might recall, is the traveling companion of Paul and Barnabas, or Barnabas and Saul when they started out. And for a very short time, Paul was unhappy that John Mark didn't stay with them on the trip, but went home early, and Barnabas wanted to bring him again, and Paul didn't want him to come. And there is sort of this tendency in church history to think that everybody who has the same name in the book, in the Bible, are all related or the same person, and the opportunities for someone to be named something else. I mean, even though, as I've said, I've heard some estimates that 10% of the people in Israel and 20 were named John, and 10% were named John, and 25% of the women were named Mary. Is it John Mark? Okay, sure, maybe. Don't really know. Really have no idea. The tradition goes back to an early church father named Papias. He lived in the early 2nd century. His tradition is kept alive in Eusebius, who's a 4th century church historian, one of the first church historians, who wrote, this is what the elder, Papias, said, Mark, who became Peter's interpreter, accurately wrote, though not in order, as many of the things said and done by the Lord as he had noted. So that this Mark, who wrote this gospel, was Peter's interpreter, Peter's editor, his publicist, that kept all that together. And I should say that he wrote everything accurately but not in order. We probably want to move away from our conception of what that word order means. We tend to think of order as A, B, C, D, E, F, G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, chronology or something like that. This is a rhetorical term, order. And it refers, probably a better way to say it would be recorded these things, but not in proper form, not in an appropriate presentation kind of form. The Luke is the one who, at the beginning of his gospel, we'll see, when he opens it up, he said, many have undertaken to write, but I decided to write an orderly account. And that's not so much, they got it all out of order, as much as it is, this doesn't fit the kind of elevated rhetoric that people would expect for this kind of a story. And so I think that's what Papias is referring to when he says not in order. He's referring to a rhetorical way of speaking. He's not referring to chronology or anything like that. So, is this a reliable source? Sure. It's one of those things that we need to ask the question how important authorship is to begin with. I mean, it does give us a context to hear the text better, but it's probably worth noting that it wasn't important to the authorship. They didn't think that authorship was important when they put it down. The author of Mark doesn't claim any eyewitness knowledge or any kind of special recording. It doesn't claim to be the words of anyone else. It's one of those things that none of these gospel writers try to, I guess the best way to say it, they don't try to buy authority. It's not like, well, you should listen to me because these are the words of Peter that I wrote down, or you should listen to me because I walked with Jesus. None of our canonical gospels do that. Mark just is in the Bible with no name, and they just assume the work will stand on its own, which is interesting. So I've always said for us, authorship is sort of historical curiosity, but it doesn't affect authority, which is ironic since that's where the word comes from. Because ultimately we believe that God is the author behind this text, and that if that's the case, this text is authoritative. It doesn't matter who put pen to paper at that point. It's curious, but that question's already answered. It's all right, though, because the Gospels are all about spoilers. We're going to see that tonight when it's talking. But there's no spoiler warnings on the Gospel. They just tell the story just right out and spoil it from the very beginning. It's just... we have very strong feelings about spoilers in our family. We don't like to do that to people. If we find out you haven't watched something, we don't want to let you know that, Luke is Darth Vader's son. We don't want to say it. Ay, dang it. But anyway, Gospels don't care about that. How early? Don't know. I mean, I'm going to say I don't know a lot about a lot of this. The earliest tradition claims that Mark wrote after Peter's death, which would have been about 64, 65 in Rome. That's tradition. That works as far as the date is concerned. I have seen individuals date this book as early as in the 40s and as late as in the 70s. But ultimately, we just don't know. That would be the 0070s, not the 1970s.
Okay,
yeah, no, just
imagining
the 70s.
Some Roman hippies walking.
No, bell bottoms. No, that was what everybody wore in the 70s back then. No, the 60s is traditional, and so that works for me. Like I said, the sort of mnemonic device I use, Mark is the 60s, Matthew's the 70s, Luke is the 80s, and John is the 90s. That works as good as anything on the dates on that. It was not my favorite gospel to translate, I'll be honest. The Greek, the organization of Mark is incredibly clever. The Greek is lousy. It's just not great Greek. And I think I mentioned last week. In fact, when you see that Luke is copying a passage from Mark, very often he fixes the Greek so it's more elegant when he does, which just makes me laugh when we think about these things. That just imagine him, God, that's no way to say that. It's difficult Greek at times because the subject-verb agreement is awkward, and it's just not. It's not an elegant Greek like Luke. Luke is lofty Greek in that regard. So that was one of my least favorite things about Mark. But I've come to appreciate a lot of really clever things that Mark does as we go through it. So let's look at what's going on. Where was it written? Again, don't know. Tradition is that it was written in Rome. There are several Latin loan words that are used in this to describe a number of different things, but there's very little evidence in the gospel as to where it might be written. We do get an explanation we get translation of the Aramaic whenever it's used, and we get an explanation of some of the Jewish customs, but not all. The author seems to think that the audience doesn't know Aramaic, but does know about, for example, what the word Hosanna means, or what Gehenna is, or who Satan is, because on those three terms are never translated or explained. But other Aramaic is. So it's interesting what we can assume his audience knew and what they didn't. We really don't know. So we say possible for an audience unfamiliar with at least some parts of Judaism. And there are some suggestions. Actually, that last point is a suggestion of Richard Balcom, and I tend to defer to him on a lot because he's very smart on these issues. And he suggested that this gospel, and actually all the gospels, should be read as written for a wider audience in the Roman Empire rather than be understood as written for a particular church community, which is a different way of looking at the gospels than a lot of scholars do. Most scholars assume we're writing this gospel to the church in Rome, and then it gained popularity beyond that. Or John is written to the churches in Turkey, and it gained popularity beyond that. But Balcom suggests that maybe we should read all of these letters as encyclicals, as wide circulating letters throughout the empire, which is an interesting point, and may have a point on that. So I don't know, maybe. How's the book organized? Best to think of it in two parts. There is on the way to Caesarea Philippi and on the way to Jerusalem. Those are the two parts of the gospel. The first half of the book, who is Jesus? This miracle worker, this teacher, this Son of Man. And that is the journey up to Caesarea Philippi, which is the furthest north you can be, basically, in Palestine. It is, in modern Israel, it's as far north, really, as you can go. It's as far away from Jerusalem as you can get, basically. It's probably a little bit north of Dan. It's pretty close to Dan. And Dan to Beersheba was the traditional boundaries of ancient Israel. And so, it's way, way up in the north. And then after that moment in 830, which is the who do people say that I am question, from that moment on, it's a move toward Jerusalem and crucifixion. So as I said before, the synoptics only have one journey to Jerusalem, and Mark is the one that establishes that pattern. He's only making one trip in this story because for Mark, it's the only trip that mattered. So we don't know how many others that he might have made, but this is the one that mattered. So that's the one we talk about for the last half of the gospel. Let us move on to the beginning. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. From the very beginning, we, the readers, know exactly who Jesus is. The author has spoiled it from us right at the start. we know that this is the beginning of the good news, the gospel, the euangelion, of Jesus, who is the Messiah. Remember, Christos is the translation of Messiah in Hebrew, which means anointed, Messiah. So this is Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So we know Jesus is Messiah and Jesus is Son of God. This is important because nobody else in the story gets it. Almost nobody else in the story gets it. Would be a better way to say it. Just a couple of folks. Also should point out that there was no punctuation in ancient Greek manuscripts. Remember all of the majuscule or the uncial manuscripts we looked at. All the words are continuous script and there's no punctuation. As a result, it is suggested, and I think compellingly so, that this could be read as the beginning of the gospel or good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it's written in the prophet Isaiah. That's one sentence. And making the point that the gospel is the fulfillment of this Isaianic prophecy. In fact, you might recall last week that it is Isaiah that gives us the word gospel. Isaiah 63 in the 60:3 in the Septuagint says the gospel, I proclaim the good news to the poor, the gospel to the poor. Also should put out that Mark gets his quote wrong here. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, this part is in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 3. This part is in Malachi. So Mark has conflated two Old Testament passages into one and attributed them both to Isaiah.
As an Old Testament professor, how does that make you feel?
How does that make me feel as an Old Testament professor? What I assume has happened is that, first of all, this is not something anyone would have cared about, except us. And it also, to me, I wonder if it is not part of maybe a lectionary reading or a litany that they might have had. We sometimes wonder if there were not arrangements of texts that were kind of cleverly put together. They were thought of together in the same way. I mean, obviously these are dealing with Messiah questions, and both of those passages are dealing with Messiah questions. And so I don't want to say Mark was confused. I don't want to say that Mark was wrong. I want to say that Mark was dealing with texts that were familiar to him in a way that would have been received that way. Okay. It doesn't bother me that much. Okay. I mean, They can do this. I'm going to call someone else out when they say that, the Bible says that, cleanliness is next to godliness. Benjamin Franklin said that. The Bible doesn't say that. So that one I would get on to folks about. This one bothers some folks, and I'm not one of the folks it bothers. So I said that nobody else got Jesus' identity as Son of God. We, the reader, know. None of the characters do. Well, almost none of the characters do. Characters do call him Messiah or Christ, depending on your Bible's translation. God proclaims Jesus as Son at the baptism and at transfiguration. So it doesn't come as a surprise to God that Jesus is the Son of God here. That's probably good news. Demons also recognize that Jesus is Son of God. The only human being to explicitly call Jesus Son of God is the centurion at the crucifixion. Surely this man was the Son of God. He is the only human being that explicitly makes that confession in the text, sort of. We have an implicit confession that I think is really, really interesting, and we'll talk about that one maybe tonight, maybe not, I don't know. But it is absolutely true that the Roman centurion makes the most startling confession of faith in this gospel. The disciples don't get it. His family doesn't get it. The religious establishment doesn't get it. His hometown doesn't get it. Nobody understands who Jesus is in Mark. And I will say in Mark, when you just read Mark, there is a little more friction between Jesus and the disciples in Mark than you get in other gospels. Jesus is a little less patient with them. Several places in Mark, he will ask the question, "Are you still that dull? Do you still not understand?" And the disciples can get a little snippy back with him. We saw that last week in the storm passage where Mark says, where the disciples say to Jesus, "Don't you care that we're perishing?" And Jesus says back to them, "Have you still no faith?" I mean, there's just not a lot of patience going on. We'll see that in one of the stories tonight as well, that friction between them. We jump into the story right after that confession. As you saw, John the Baptist begins his preaching and baptizing and prophesying that Jesus is coming. Mark is fast moving. Mark is a great sort of movie script. You hit the ground running in Mark. There is no infancy narrative. There's no birth narrative. Jesus just John appears on the scene and Jesus right after that. So we read to verse 9. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming, so you don't get any of the protesting, none of that. We don't get a lot of detail in this one. Just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." In Mark, it's not clear who all hears this confession or sees this happen. It seems that others heard that voice from heaven, but here, as Jesus was coming out of the water, Jesus saw the heavens torn and the Spirit descending like a dove on him, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved." Not "this is," like we get at the Transfiguration, an address to the disciples who are standing there and they need to listen, like we've heard in other places. That, to me, has always been an interesting question. So, Jesus is baptized. Mark 1:12, the Spirit immediately, this word is one of the most common words in the Gospel of Mark. Immediately. Everything happens right now in Mark. Immediately after this, the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and was in the wilderness with wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. But we're not going to go into a lot of detail.
We don't have time to unpack all of that.
Obviously, Matthew will give you the details of what those temptations were like, and the food question and all that. No time for that, right? He was in the wilderness 40 days, wild beasts, angels. It was pretty cool. Anyway, that was it. That's the whole story for John. Like I said, fast-moving gospel, Mark. Now, after John was arrested, so John now has been arrested, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news, the gospel of God, saying, "The time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven has come near. Repent and believe in the good news," believe in the gospel. So, 3 aspects to this proclamation. One, it's time. We're there. The kingdom of heaven, that Old Testament prophecy of coming, is at hand. Some translations have "within you," which is not a great translation. "Under your nose" might be a better way to look at it. Right here. It's time. This, ta-da! I mean, here it is. The kingdom of heaven is at hand means you can reach it. We say it as it's become kind of a phrase that we don't realize that what Jesus is saying is, it's now. It's time. So, turn from your way. Repent. Make a turn. And believe and accept this gospel that is, it's now. It's me. This is what's happening. So he's already started preaching that quick. We're 14 verses in. He's baptized. He's endured the temptations. John's been arrested. A lot of stuff happening in 14 verses. So a little bit later, they went to, same chapter, right? They went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit convulsing him and crying with a loud voice came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. So he's in the north, on the eastern shore of the Galilee, in Capernaum, and teaching in the synagogue with a level of authority they're surprised by. He doesn't have that typical pedigree that you would expect. He doesn't come from the good schools in Jerusalem. He doesn't have a rabbi he studied with. He's simply teaching with authority, and even these unclean spirits obey. And that causes the reputation to spread. Well, as soon as that happened, as soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John, who he's called just before this. Now Simon's mother-in-law, which does imply that Simon was married, because as I understand it, that's how that works. You only get a mother-in-law if in fact you're married. So it's always been fun to know that the tradition in the Catholic Church is Peter was the first pope, and of course he was married. So we don't bring up a lot of that. That doesn't get a lot of press, I would think, but it's fun. Now, Simon, it's fun when you're a Baptist and you want to poke your Catholic friends. That's why that's fun. When you get a little stick and you can poke them, it's fun. But it's what Jesus would do. You know what? That might not be Jesus. I might be thinking of somebody else. Anyway, Simon was thinking of me. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. The fever had left her, and she began to serve them, which seems like a really mean thing to do to a woman who's been near death, right? You just, now that you're better, could you go make some, please? We're starving, and that's not very nice. What's going on here, and this is something we're going to miss because of our culture, she is being restored socially. That it is not just a healing that is taking place. She is now being allowed to fulfill the role in the society. Now we can debate how appropriate that role is, but that role in society that she was previously unable to because of her illness. So she is being restored to physical health. She's also being restored socially in this as well. That's an important part of the gospel message in Mark, is this restoration of people who have been outcast socially. We're going to see that a lot tonight as well. So, good? Then I put this part in here because I made an observation that my dear friend and former podcast partner Mike McKeever thought was brilliant. And so since I made something that Mike was willing to concede was brilliant, I felt like I needed to draw attention to that, to pat myself on the back and spike the football. If that's
so humble.
I am. Hey, my humility is one of the best things. Maybe not. Anyway, that evening at sundown, they so that's now it's the evening after the Sabbath, right? So it's Saturday night at this point. Friday night was Sabbath. He's taught in the synagogue. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Interesting. We'll talk about that in a minute. In the morning, so Sunday morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." I just mentioned to Mike has talked about in Mark how there's a lot of foreshadowing of what's coming later on. And I said to Mike, well, then isn't it interesting that very early before the dark on Sunday morning, Jesus goes missing and everyone goes searching for him, which, of course, you might recall later on in the gospel, Sunday morning has an important, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but Easter Sunday morning before Jesus goes missing and everybody goes searching for him at the same time.
I get it.
Good. I'm glad. Thomas finally. I just had to walk in there.
Hey.
Anyway, that he said, "Let's go to the neighboring town, so I might proclaim the message there also." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in the synagogues, and still casting out demons. So we don't get a lot of detail on the healings, but there's a lot of healings taking place. We do get this one. A leper came to him, begging him. Kneeling, he said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose." Now, significant here, leper is unclean. Jesus is now touching that which is unclean. And instead of Jesus becoming unclean, the unclean thing is cleansed. So the marginalization again is significant. It's a reversal here. He is being restored once again. Immediately, the leprosy left him and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, and he sent him away. And we got a lot of antecedent issues on this, okay? So Jesus, after warning the leper, Jesus sent the leper away at once, saying to the leper, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country, and the people came to him from every quarter. So make sure that you don't say anything. And the man left and told everybody. So this brings us to one of the really sort of odd features of the synoptics, Mark and Matthew in particular. Matthew certainly, I think, picking it up from Mark. And that's what's known as the Messianic Secret. Jesus silences the demons, you've already seen. He always kept the demons from talking because they knew who he was. And he silences the disciples. He silences the leper who is healed. Don't tell anybody. He doesn't let anyone say, he tells them not to. Whatever you do, don't tell anybody who I am. These commands for silence are called the Messianic Secret in the Gospels. He does call himself Son of Man. He does that publicly and often, but he doesn't let anybody spread the news about this kind of nature of who he is. I have heard a lot of theories about why this is, and some of them, frankly, are just dumb. Usually I have a great deal of respect for other theories, and I try to at least allow the possibility for their entertaining, but I just don't for some of these, namely the first one. The first argument I have heard on this is that, well, what Jesus is doing is he's using reverse psychology. You tell people don't do something, and you know they're going to go do it. Jesus, knowing people as Jesus does, don't you go telling anybody about this. Okay.
Oh, stop.
Stop it. Don't say anything. No, I'm sorry. I don't believe in a passive-aggressive Messiah. I just don't.
You believe in one that laughs. Maybe
I do believe in one who laughs, but I don't believe in a passive-aggressive Messiah. Some say the secret had to be maintained to bring about the crucifixion. So in other words, Jesus knows the path that this is taking and is going to bring it about by keeping the secret. Badly, because everybody's going on. I think the most compelling argument, and the one that makes the most sense to me, is that Jesus as Messiah can only be understood in light of the crucifixion. That you're not going to understand who Jesus is until crucifixion, resurrection. Then you can start, because right now, if you go start spreading the message, you're spreading an incomplete message. You're spreading even a misleading message. Because you're going to let people think I'm not the kind of Messiah that they think I am. You have to wait until after crucifixion. Then it makes sense. That to me is the best argument for the Messianic Secret, is that Jesus is, but when you see how important crucifixion is, I don't think you can miss that. So, okay, Mark 3. He went up to a mountain and called to him those whom he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him, and to be sent out to proclaim the message, and to have authority to cast out demons. So he appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. Spoiler alert, he does that later in the Gospels, so this, just so you don't get confused on that.
There is no suspense.
No suspense on this, not really. James, son of Zebedee, and James, John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is the sons of thunder, the Boanerges.
Thor. Why did he name him Thor?
Thor, well, because he didn't speak Norwegian, I guess. I mean, that would be my guess. And Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Canaanian and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. Spoiler alert on that one too. Going to be looking forward to, again, Thomas is right. No suspense. It also implies to me, I sort of think, that the people that Mark is writing this gospel to know this story. By the way, Simon, that's the guy named Peter.
Hey, remember?
Peter, I've heard of him. Okay, this is Simon. Got it. All right, it makes sense. Judas,
This is the meet the team section.
It is the meet the team section. Thaddeus, sometimes also called Judas, by the way. And so there's Judas and the Judas Iscariot. So after he does this, then he went home. And the crowd came together, so they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying he has gone out of his mind. That's the kind of support that Jesus got from the family. They thought he was nuts, so they needed to restrain him because people were saying he was crazy. So they don't get it in Mark. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he has Beelzebul. Not Beelzebub, Beelzebul. Beelzebul means Baal is prince. Beelzebub means Lord of the Flies, and most everyone believes that Beelzebub is a intentional scribal corruption of Beelzebul, because they would never want to say that a false god is prince. They would want to say that this is the poopy god, the Lord of the Flies, which is the Lord of the Flies. The poopy god is Lord of the Flies is the poopy god. That's the best way I notice. Your god's a poopy god. Anyway. It's by Beelzebul, that the ruler of demons, he casts out demons. He called to them and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. If Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he can't stand, but his end has come. And no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. I wonder if this is not, Jesus is now plundering Satan's house in this story, and he has apparently tied up the strong man, and the assumption is the binding occurred back in the wilderness part that we didn't get. That's this part of the story we didn't hear. That's why Jesus is doing so well. Now, right after this, this is the initial part. Right after this, the family shows up again. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you. This is later in the chapter after they've come to get him because they thought he was out of his mind, right? He replied, who are my mother and my brothers? Hope he didn't finish right there, because otherwise it'd be a little awkward. And looking at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother. So Jesus is now redefining family. He has already taken James and John away from the Father, which is crazy, right? I mentioned that in a sermon a time or two. Father, the image of father in the first century is not a positive one. Fathers are overbearing. They are dictatorial. And frankly, let's put it this way: the emperor of Rome, the image that he was most comfortable with was the father of the emperor. I'm the father of all of you, and. So think of emperor when you think of household father as well. They were controlling and dictatorial. You will also notice there is no redefinition of father. Redefinition of mother, brothers, and sisters. Father here is only reserved for God, your Father in heaven. So you don't get a new father, but you get new mothers and brothers and sisters in the church, because God is the Father in heaven, which I find that is interesting. So that the authority here is being redefined. Family is being redefined. This is a thoroughly countercultural and revolutionary idea. This redefinition of family in the early church. I was just sharing this week. It's also one of those things that makes it really hard to understand who's related to anybody, because everyone in the early church would have seen everyone else as brother or sister, and so it's hard to know. Brother of Jesus, real brother of Jesus, or brother of Jesus? Because is everyone the brother? They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. Though this man is unnamed, Mike and I were taking to calling him Gary, because he was the Gerasene demoniac. So he is Gary. He went and it stuck. For 3 years of the podcast, we called him Gary. Now I think of Gary every time I think about this. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. So obviously, this man is about as unclean as you can get. He's in a Gentile area, he's living in the tombs, and he has demons in him. That's about as bad as unclean. That's an unclean man, really, all the way around. He'd been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, shackles broken to pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling, and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me. For he had said to him, come out of the man. The flash forward. Jesus said, that's why the man's yelling. Because Jesus had said to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. Then Jesus asked him, what is your name? He replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. This is in no way a subtle dig at the Romans. He is in an area that is absolutely where the Romans came in when they would march through Palestine later on in the century. And the name of the demons is Legion. This is a Roman organization of the military. There's no subtleness in this at all. He is absolutely, again, countercultural and poking the Romans. He begged him, that is, Legion begged Jesus earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, send us into the swine, let us enter them. So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out, entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, that's a big herd of swine, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. So what happens to Gary? Well, the swine herds, the people who are herding the swine, which I wasn't even aware of being a term, because shepherds do sheep, I guess, but swineherd is a word. I didn't know that one. I would have probably used pig shepherd, but I don't know. I just never knew that word till pig shepherd, swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then the people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, implying he's been naked and breaking all these chains and running around through the tombs. They were the very man who had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. And he was getting into so this guy is able to cast demons out, but it's also bad for the economy because we just lost all these pigs. So better for you to not. You're causing us an economic loss here, Jesus. Could you just go? Sure, I'm glad the guy's better, but at what cost? 2,000 pigs? Is one guy really worth 2,000 pigs, Jesus? Get back in the boat. So anyway, they began to beg Jesus to leave. As he was getting into the boat, the man, this Gary, who had been possessed by the demons, I got a tickle in my throat, begged him that he might be with him. Please, right? Jesus, please take me with you. But Jesus refused and said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you. Complete flip, right? Everyone else has to keep silent. Don't tell anybody. But he tells this man, go and tell everyone what the Lord has done for you. What does the man do? And Gary went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis, the 10 cities in that area, how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. Did you see what just happened? Did you see what Gary just did? Go and tell everyone what the Lord has done for you. And Gary went and told everyone what Jesus did. Jesus is God. Jesus is Lord to Gary. He gets it. This is a guy who gets it. So when I said that the Roman centurion was the only one who confessed Jesus, he's the only one who verbally confesses that Jesus is Son of God. Gary gets it too. He absolutely confesses that Jesus is Lord. So this is again, these functional claims for deity in the text. We don't get those declarations that we might be more comfortable with. They happen functionally, and they happen like this.
And the fact that Gary is saying
that Jesus is Lord. I told you it sticks, doesn't it? Gary sticks. It works perfect. Yeah, and Gary's making, and it's a private private miracle that becomes public. And that's about to be inverted in a second, where we get a public miracle that becomes private. Let's look at one more story. This one's pretty famous too. When Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be made well and live. So he went with him. Big crowd that's gathered. Jairus comes and asks. So a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. This is a very common Markan tactic. Sometimes people call them Markan sandwiches. Because what happens is Mark starts telling one story, then in the middle of that story you get another story, and then you get the conclusion of the story at the bottom of that. He also tells parables that way. So you get a parable, and then another parable, and then the interpretation of the first parable that comes a little bit later. So sometimes ABA kind of stories, you see this with the Markan sandwich. This is a classic Markan sandwich, right? Jairus, come here, heal my little daughter. Okay, on the way there, this woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. Woman suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years means she cannot go to the synagogue. She is a societal outcast. She has no wealth. She has no position in society. She is again, marginalized, on the edge. She endured much under many physicians, spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. So she had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Now here's where we start to get to go snarky disciples I was talking about. His disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, who touched me? What kind of a stupid question is this, Jesus? It's like, who touched you? Everybody touched you. There's a crowd here.
Son of God, make a hole.
Son of God, make a hole. Yeah, exactly. No, they didn't get that. They didn't get Son of God. Messiah, make a hole. He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well, healed you. The word for salvation and the word for healing are exactly the same in Hebrew. So your faith has saved you, your faith has healed you. Same statement. No way to know. Go in peace, be healed of your disease, be saved from your disease. And now she's restored. Again, socially, this healing has not just healed her body, it has restored her to a place in society. This gospel is restorative. It brings justice and moves away from marginalization. And these people who are on the outskirts and the people who are suffering find hope and healing and a way in which they can contribute in the way to that society in meaningful ways. It's a beautiful thing. It really is a beautiful thing. But we're not done because he's still on the way to go see Jairus, right? Jairus' daughter. So while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house. So we're back to the first story again. Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. He allowed no one to follow except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So now what has happened? This very public healing is now come down to a very private healing that has come. It's just this beautiful inversion that Mark is doing here, where we had a private healing that became a big deal, and now we have this big deal that's become a private heal. This is just cool to me. When they came to the house, the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he'd entered, he said to them, why do you make a commotion to weep? The child's not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. So, this beautiful restoration. By the way, pay attention to this. He speaks Aramaic, and a miracle happens. So he left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, where does this man get all this? What is this wisdom that he's been given? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. I mean, he didn't have that kind of training to tell them. We don't know exactly what he said. Luke gives us some detail on that, but nothing here in Mark, just that they were offended by his teaching. Jesus said to them, prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, and among their own kin, and in their own house. And how about this phrase? He could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. This is absolutely the appropriate translation. If anything, it's toned down. He was unable to do any miracles in his hometown because of their lack of faith. He was astounded by their lack of faith, and as a result could do no miracles. He only works miracles to the level of people's belief. Matthew softens this. Okay, Matthew says he didn't do any miracles. Mark explicitly says he couldn't. He was unable to do any miracles because of their lack of faith. If you're going to amaze Jesus, let's not amaze Jesus at our lack of faith. That's a bad thing. We're only going to be able to do what we believe can happen in this. Deeply troubling. I think at the end of the day, we'll just move on, I think, from that. Don't you think? We don't want to talk about that too much. No, it's fascinating to me that this lack of faith, that Jesus is able to work.
I can't work under these
I
conditions.
cannot work. If you don't believe it can happen, it's not going to happen. I mean, there's something to that I think is just, it's compelling. It's interesting. Well, we are going to make it to the halfway point. This is exciting. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, again, as far north as you can get. And on the way, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? They answered him, John the Baptist, others Elijah. John's dead at this point. Others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. He asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. And you notice in Mark, you are the Messiah, period. In Matthew, you are the Messiah, Son of the living God. But that's not what he says in Mark. In Mark, no one says that until we get to the end. And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about it. So this confession, they're right, but don't say anything. Now he tries to tell them what that means. And this is where it goes sideways for him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. That's what it means to be Messiah, just so you know. And he said all this quite openly. I love that line. He just told everyone. He just said that The people are listening, Jesus. That's the committee meeting. We do that in committee. You don't do that in the sanctuary. What's the matter with you? So Peter decides to take him aside, because, you don't want to rebuke Jesus openly. Never goes well. But takes him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. That's not good. So he decided to rebuke Peter publicly and says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." So in an M. Night Shyamalan twist no one saw coming, Peter is actually Satan. I mean, that's quite a surprise. No, what does this mean? Well, it means that Peter is very well-meaning, very well-intentioned, and I think responding from a perspective of human things that makes complete sense. The Messiah doesn't get crucified. The Messiah doesn't get rejected. The Messiah is celebrated. And look, yeah, you've had some setbacks, Jesus. Some people don't like you, but you're just being negative. You'll be fine, okay? You've got us with you. Don't share openly all this negative stuff. It's going to be okay. Messiah doesn't let that happen. He's really trying to encourage Jesus. And Jesus decides to publicly make the point, that's not what I just said. That is not at all what I just said. I just said this is what happens to the Son of Man. And you need to adjust to that. You need to expect that, because that's what's coming. And from here on, that's what's coming. He's on his way down there. So he called the crowd with his disciples and said, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross," shameful, humiliating way of dying, cruel way of dying, maybe the cruelest death that people have ever devised. Take that up, embrace that stigma of cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who lose it for my life lose their life for my sake, and for the sake of the gospel will save it. What will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with holy angels. So making that point, you absolutely cannot be thinking about this the way you've always thought about this. The world is being turned upside down. We're doing this a completely different way than you're expecting. So you just got to expect that. that you don't know what's happening.